Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Alexander, president of the Mellon Foundation. I'd like to begin by inviting all of you to say hello in the chat. We would love to know who you are, what you're thinking about. Throughout the program, we hope that we'll see lots of audience engagement, including any questions you may have, or you can save those questions to the Q&A period at the end of the discussion. And so it's now my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Chinese American History, Asian American Experiences. Across the United States, Chinese American stories are woven into the very fabric of our collective history. And these stories reach back for generations, encompassing the entirety of the American experience, including labor movements and legislation, agriculture, immigration, the arts, education, activism. The influence of Chinese Americans on American culture runs throughout this country's society, but too many of those stories remain segmented, undertold, or underacknowledged. And as a result, too few have a fuller, more informed understanding of Chinese American histories and Asian American experiences within the profoundly complex history of the United States. And so joining us this afternoon for a discussion on these vital and varied and impossible to get our arms all the way around topics are three extraordinary authors, scholars, and advocates: Dr. Erika Lee, Dr. Mae Ngai, and Helen Zia. I am so honored to be in the presence of these extraordinary women. Dr. Erika Lee is an award-winning historian and author and the Regents Professor of History and Asian American Studies at the University of Minnesota. The granddaughter of Chinese immigrants, she grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area and co-authored with Judy Young the foundational text on the history of Angel Island and its immigration station. This is among many publications. This is the short version for everybody. Her most recent book is America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States. And you might recall seeing her on PBS's series, The Asian Americans, where you took us all to the classroom in the most powerful and edifying way. So welcome to you, Dr. Erika Lee.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Mae Ngai is a United States legal and political historian, an award-winning author, and the Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies and Professor of History at Columbia University. Before becoming a historian, she was a labor union organizer and educator in New York City, working for District 65 UAW and the Consortium for Worker Education. Her most recent book is The Chinese Question, The Gold Rushes and Global Politics. Welcome, Dr. Mae Ngai.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
And Helen Zia is a renowned journalist, activist, and critically acclaimed author in so many different areas of who we are in our fullness. Among other remarkable works, she was executive editor of Ms. Magazine, a founding board co-chair of the Women's Media Center, and in 2010, a witness in the federal marriage equality case decided by the United States Supreme Court. Her most recent book is Last Boat Out of Shanghai, the epic story of the Chinese who fled Mao's revolution. We are so glad that you're here. I'm so proud to be talking to you. I've admired you forever and ever and learned so much from you. Helen Zia.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's such an honor to be here with you.
So we are going to start our conversation, and we have a whole lot to cover. So I wanted to start first by asking each of you, in your various writings, you write about the history as the history of families, and have sometimes followed individuals or told the stories of individuals or families in order to move us to larger histories. I would like each of you to share with us one of those stories who you found in some way illustrative or representative of the history that you're exploring. And why don't we start with Erika?
I'd be happy to start. I think many of us come to this history from certainly the academic side, but for me, writing about Asian American history is very much of a personal endeavor. And so I have researched and written about my own family's history in nearly every book that I've written. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the Angel Island book, because I am the granddaughter of immigrants who were detained on Angel Island. And so finding my grandparents' immigration files, including their wedding photo that had been confiscated by immigration officials and written all over and then stuck back into a file not to be found for a good 50, 60 years until I opened up that archive box, was both a wonderful reclaiming of our family's history and past, but also a very stark and sobering reminder of the impact of discriminatory exclusion laws, of course, on the macro level, but then on that micro level, the fact that this cherished family heirloom had been defaced and taken away from us was, quite a moving experience, and reminds me every day of connecting those intimate details, the personal stories, the oftentimes hidden family histories, to the broader context, the larger political, social, economic themes and contexts that we try to write about in American history more broadly.
And I wonder, from that incredible example, and also from the way in which your history work has reached broader audiences, what are some opportunities that you've had to talk to people about archives as places that can also belong to them, official records, official places that the intent can be almost sort of reclaimed? I would love to hear more about that.
Yes. So I wrote the Angel Island book with my mentor and colleague and friend to, I think, all of us, Judy Young, who was instrumental in helping to preserve the histories of former detainees at Angel Island, and also to help preserve the actual historic site and to nominate it as a National Historic Landmark. And working on this book over many years, I recognized how much both the history, the academic history, had changed, but also, in particular, Chinese Americans' relationship to that history. So that when Judy was collecting oral histories in the 1970s, 70s and 80s, she had to use all of her pull and influence within the community to recruit individuals who would sit down for an interview, a tape recorded interview, and they were willing to do that, but they weren't willing to share their names publicly, so that when the first volume of oral histories of Angel Island detainees was published in the 1980s, it's anonymous, or Mr. Chin or Ms. Wong. Mm-hmm. Fast forward a couple of decades, by the time that we wrote Angel Island, Immigrant Gateway to America, published in 2010 on the centennial of the immigration station's opening, there were lines of people waiting to speak to us, mostly to Judy, and sharing their family histories, saying, we went to the archives, we found our family documents. Can we tell our story to you? We have more stories to tell. And they wanted it recorded. They wanted it to be shared. They wanted it to be known to a wider world. I think part of that is the opening of the archives and these documents to the community. But another is Chinese Americans changing understandings of the exclusion era as not just to be something that they might feel ashamed of, but as something to understand as being a central aspect of the history of systemic racism in the United States.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. Helen, could you talk to us about family history and individual history as history?
Sure. I'm not a historian, or I don't come at telling these stories as from an academic point of view. I'm an activist first and a writer because of my activism. And so for me, it's all about telling stories that will connect people. And that's one of the reasons I think telling stories through families and individual lives is so important. So that even if somebody is reading a story that is about somebody completely different and from a very different background, they can at least relate on a human level. And that's what's so, what drives me to do the writing and the storytelling that I do. And so when you ask about a family that I'm very focused on right now is the family of Vincent Chin, who
Mm-hmm.
was a Chinese American young man in uh, about to be married. And so in 1982, he was at his All American bachelor party when it was another time, like today, of intense anti Asian hatred. And it was an economic recession in the country, an economic depression in the Midwest, and certainly in Detroit, where he was. And when he was out for his bachelor party, he was sitting across from two white auto workers in Detroit who looked at him and said, "It's because of you mother F's that we're out of work." So they connected it to the time. And then they uh, tracked him through the streets of Detroit. They stalked him. They found him. They took a Louisville Slugger baseball bat and bashed his head into the street. And so that would have been a terrible tragedy enough. But then when it came time to be sentenced, the sentencing judge said to the two now very clean cut white men who are wearing suits now, and said, "Oh, these are not the kind of men you send to jail." And so
Mm.
he sentenced them to probation, gave them basically a a free pass. And so I got involved in that as an activist, but then also as a storyteller to look at who was Vincent Chin, what was his family story, who were these people. And it didn't take long at all to find out that the family of Vincent Chin, his mother Lily, his father CW, had, in a way, the quintessential Chinese American story. His father
Mm-hmm.
had been a laborer, a laundry worker, a restaurant worker. He had come from southern China, the Toisan region, and he was limited in his ability to get anything beyond working in the service industries where Chinese during that whole period were relegated. And he was only able to be married because in World War II, in his late 30s, he signed up as a GI and fought in World War II. And as an American GI, was then given the privilege to get a wife. And because up until then, this whole exclusion period that both Erika and Mae have written so much about, um, Chinese in America were denied just even the right to have a family. So because of that, he was able to get a wife from China. Up until then, Chinese women were restricted from entering the US by federal law. And so he and Lily Chin got married. They were unable to have children. They adopted Vincent from the same region in China and raised him as their only child, poured every ounce of love that they could have into him, only then to have him attacked and beaten to death on the eve of his wedding, doing the All American bachelor party. And ironically, his father had fought in World War II, to for the
Mm.
freedom of America. Yet his son was attacked because he was seen as an enemy to America. So that is a story that I've written about. I've told as a writer, as an activist for many years, and this year is the 40th anniversary of that terrible killing. And so there's a lot of activity going on that I'm involved in, and really many people are involved in, trying to not only note the tragedy, but to take the lessons of how a community came together out of a tragedy, to organize, to come together as not just Chinese Americans, but also as Asian Americans, and then to join with the African American community of Detroit. There's a large Arab American community, people from all walks of life and faiths and backgrounds, and really looking at that, what happened 40 years ago, and how people came together to right a wrong and to stand together to really fight for safety and the humanity of all people is the kind of story that you know that I think is very important for all people to connect to, because there are many injustices and fault lines we see in America today, and I think if we can only connect on a human level and stand for the humanity of all people, um, we would be able to move a lot more forward today than where we are.
Thank you. And just to follow up, I mean, when you talk about being an activist and moving into writing as another manifestation of your activism, it makes me think of the way that Frederick Douglass wrote his narrative. You know, he was an abolitionist, speaking and speaking and speaking and speaking. And then, you know, the movement said, well, you can't be everywhere, so the word can travel. So I don't know if there's more to say about, you know, what writing itself can do when we can't be everywhere.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Frederick Douglass too, because his writing and his being able to stand up in the 1800s, he was one of the voices who stood up against the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that story in and of itself, in a time like today, when people question whether the different parts of people of America can even come together as allies, let alone in unity, to stand together for our beloved community, Frederick Douglass was one of those people. And if we could only remember that unity is not a fiction, it's not an ideal,
That's right.
but it's something that we have done over and over again. And if we could reclaim those stories, and because of the writings that Frederick Douglass did and many other people, we can actually point to those and say, this is not a fiction. We've done this. Let's learn from it. And Frederick Douglass is one of those shining examples of people reaching out and standing for all people. And he did for Chinese Americans.
Thank you so much. Mae, family and family stories and history.
Yeah, well, I just want to say first that you know, it's really amazing that it's 40 years ago that Vincent was murdered, and I know there's a lot of activities going on, and I think it's really important that, you know, that be commemorated. The violence against Vincent Chin and the violence against Erika's grandparents, when, you know, against their, maybe not their persons, but their own pieces of history. I think those are stories that are really important to tell. I wrote a book called The Lucky Ones, which approaches these questions from a slightly different angle. And you might say that some of the characters in my book might have been at Angel Island and interrogating Erika's family when they tried to come into the country. The Tape family were immigration brokers and interpreters. And they were interesting to me because they didn't represent just a single strand in Chinese American history, but they represented both the forces of inclusion and exclusion. So what do I mean by that? Well, we mostly know them because they brought one of the first civil rights cases in California against the exclusion of Chinese children from the public schools. And before the case, which is called Tape v. Hurley, which is 1885, Chinese were really excluded from any public education. And in this ruling, the court ruled that they did have the right to go to school, but then they were sent to segregated schools. So they were kind of elevated to the position of Black people, right, as segregated, not no longer entirely excluded. So they were civil rights activists on the one hand. On the other hand, as immigration brokers and as immigration interpreters, they were kind of these in-between middle people who could be both helpful to immigrants but also helpful to the government. And it's from this in-between space that they had actually a lot of power, but they also were distrusted by both sides. And so I found that their experience of both inclusion and exclusion taught us something about Chinese American history. That's not a linear path where, often people think, well, we were oppressed in the past and then, things got better and then we became included. So we went from exclusion to inclusion. And what I was trying to show with this family's experience is that you could be doing both at the same time. And even today, we see with all the violence and racism that's resurfaced, well, I feel it's never been that far beneath the surface, but we see again today what's happening. And it's clear that it's not been a linear path from exclusion to inclusion. It's been a very tortured path, and a lot of dynamics go on at the same time. So I wrote about this family because, from a narrative point of view, they were interesting, when you write about a family. But also I wanted to think about, how did people get into the middle class during the exclusion era? They were among the first Chinese American middle class people. And what I found was that this was the tiny little crack in the wall of exclusion, where if you were a broker, if you were like the person in the middle, that's how you could do it, because the government or businesses needed you because they couldn't themselves talk to the masses of immigrants. And the immigrants needed you because they didn't know how to deal with the government or the structures of entry, or, even buying a railroad ticket. So that was the tiny little crack in the wall of exclusion where people could take opportunities that they were needed in myriad ways, and then they became more assimilated, quote, I say that in quotes, quote unquote, because they still were not really fully let into white society. But anyway, that's the family story that I've told as a kind of window into thinking about the relationship between inclusion and exclusion.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to talk now about physical places, historical places. We've talked about Angel Island, which of course we would talk about that. But to hear about some other sites that either are protected and developed as historic sites where people know that they can learn, or that you think should be designated and resourced as teaching spaces. And we'll go in a different order. Helen, why don't you start?
Well, sure. Let me just say how important it is to know some of these physical spaces. I have to say I grew up as a kid, ABC, American-born Chinese, in New Jersey at a time when most Asian Americans either lived in Hawaii or ghettos of California and places like Chinatowns in the East Coast, and I didn't. So I felt like I was an alien, not citizenship-wise, but an alien invader from Mars, because that's how people saw me. And when I walked around, I often felt like, were there ever any other people who were like my family who ever walked here before? I mean, that was something I physically felt, that people were always telling me, go back where you came from. And if I said, but I'm here, I'm in New Jersey, this is where I'm from, that they would, of course, that was not their desired answer. And as I grew older, I really was on a mission to find out, were there no Asian Americans in New Jersey before? Only to find out that in Newark, New Jersey, for example, there was a whole Chinatown there. They're documented in the New York Times in the 1800s, or other places within the Northeast that there are many, many stories. There are all these little museums in New England that show these art pieces or decorative pieces from China, from Asia. Well, it wasn't just the stuff that came, there were people. They were walking on the streets. And if you look at them enough, and to a kid, even today, growing up, seeing, not seeing themselves anywhere, not seeing any of these places saying that you were here, your grandparents, your ancestors or people who look like you walked in these spaces. They fought in the Civil War. They were all throughout American history. And so there are many places like that. I mean, I've personally gone to Rock Springs, Wyoming, to look at where a famous massacre took place that was recorded in etchings, that we see today. The very first time I ever saw a picture of Asians in America was one about a massacre taking place in Denver. And if you go to Denver now, you really don't see any sign of that. But these are all places that there should be plaques or something that note that Asian Americans, people were here. And the reason that they're not so much now is because there was a whole period of ethnic cleansing, the driving out period, the exclusion period. This entire state of Idaho at one period, the largest ethnic group of people who were there were Chinese. You go to Idaho now and it's one of the 5 whitest states in the country where the different white supremacy groups try to go to. But that was once mostly an Asian, a Chinese populated place. And so I think of kids today that if they could see that you're not the only one, not only that you have a place in American history, when people say to you, go back where you came from, you can say, I am here. And not only that, my people might have been here before your people. Let's connect. Let's share our common history. So the places, there are many. And since I went on that mission to just try to find places not far from where I grew up, thinking that there were no Asian Americans here, I think all of those places are important, not just for Asians, but for all Americans, to just show the diversity of who is in America and who built this country. It really took many, many different kinds of people. And so we have to break through that master narrative that says it was only a certain kind of people from Anglo-Europe. And so, so anyway, the places are critically important.
Amazing, amazing. I'm now imagining, like, go back where you came from. Do you mean Idaho?
Right, exactly.
Mae or Erika, I'd love to hear about some places that you think are important, marked or unmarked.
I think that, if I may,
Please.
I think the effort to memorialize or place markers on historical sites obviously is so important, as Helen has said, everywhere from North Adams, Massachusetts, where Chinese were brought in the 1870s as to work in a shoe factory as strike breakers, but also in California, up and down the coast. There are a lot of places that mark murders, massacres, also old Chinatowns. But I want us to think about places where we are now, not where we were in the past and have been erased or were driven out, or is a ghost town. What about Chinatowns today? Chinatowns today, like I live in New York, Chinatown today is under a lot of pressure from gentrification. There's a housing shortage. I mean, Chinese immigrants used to come directly to Chinatown. Now there are 3 other Chinatowns in New York City where people sometimes skip Manhattan Chinatown. But Chinatown, our communities are always historical and they're also always changing. And Chinatown Chinatown here in New York has gone through a lot of struggle. First, after 9/11, it was basically shut down in part because of its proximity to Ground Zero. During the first SARS crisis, nobody would come and eat in Chinatown because it was an Asian virus. And of course, during the pandemic, Chinatown was both shut down by the lockdown, but also even as things opened up a lot of tourists were reluctant to go back into Chinatown. And so I think these are, I don't know how to say, maybe living sites that we need to also take care to educate people about. Um,
Mm-hmm.
People in Chinatown face tremendous hardships. Uh, there's a large elderly population. Some of the most active organizations in New York Chinatown are the senior centers, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I work with the Tenement Museum on the Lower East Side, which is adjacent to Chinatown. Some would say it's even now subsumed by Chinatown, or is a war between Chinatown and the hipsters, you know, that have moved into the Lower East Side. But you know, there's an exhibit there that I helped work on about a Chinese family that lived in the building in the 1960s and 70s, and there's a garment, kind of a garment work at home shop that's set up there. So I think we need to find ways to also educate people about places that are our communities today, and to help people think through how they've changed over time. You know, Chinatown started as a segregated ghetto. You know, people didn't always live just in Chinatown, but they were increasingly not allowed to live anywhere else. But then it became a vibrant ethnic community, um, and we don't want to think of it as a tourist trap, right? Where tourists go for where buildings are turned over and the rents skyrocket, and then white artists start moving in. You know, so I think these are all issues that we confront today, and if we can think about place as not just historical, as important as that is, obviously, but also something in our own time. There's a cute group in New York called MSG, which is called the Mott Street Girls, but they have a take on the MSG, and they do walking tours of historic New York Chinatown, and they also do a food tour. So I think these are some of the activities that we can help promote and invite people to appreciate our communities as places where real people live, not just stereotypes or not just tourist occasions.
Thank you, Erika.
Yeah, these are wonderful questions, and I love everything that Helen and Mae have said. I'm going to try to connect them a bit, partly because I've been teaching a long time, and I'm getting a little frustrated now, 20 plus years into the teaching, whereby I welcome a new class into the space to learn about Asian American history. And I always start with, what do we already know? What do we already know about Asian American history? And I would have hoped that by the time, 20 years after starting to ask this question, that my students would be able to list many, many, many more things other than the Chinese built the railroad and we incarcerated Japanese Americans. To be honest, 20 years ago, most students, I mean, even those events were hard for them to recall. And so when I think about the need, the continuing need to make sure places like Rock Springs, Wyoming, I have also been there and have not seen anything, but also places like Seattle, which forcibly expelled their Chinese American population in 1886. There is one measly little plaque, or in LA, where the largest mass lynching happened in US history, where 18 Chinese immigrants were murdered. There is still just a little plaque. And we absolutely need to use these spaces as living classrooms, not just about the past. So going back to what Helen was talking about, and remembering and preserving that past, but also connecting it to the present. Right now, there are some really interesting conversations and activism around reckoning with, of course, our history of racism generally, but anti-Asian violence as well. And so you have places like Antioch, California, a year ago, became the first city in the United States to offer an official apology for its treatment of Chinese immigrants. basically an expulsion that happened in 1876, the burning down of a Chinatown. These are all very common throughout the American West at this time, but also the fact that Antioch was a sundown town, which made it illegal for Chinese immigrants, Chinese Americans to be out in public after sundown. I grew up about half an hour away from Antioch, California. And I also am a historian of Asian America and of the Chinese American experience. And until the news started reporting on Antioch's apology, I had not known. I had not known that this town that I drove by a lot had this tremendous and tremendously violent history. There's so much more that we need to preserve, use. So not just preserve so that we can walk by, but to use in an effort to educate the next generation. It's already happening in many of these kinds of instances, but I also wanted to cite one more example, and that is in Berkeley, where parts of Shattuck Avenue have now been renamed Kala Bagai Way, named after an Indian American woman, one of the first and few to come in the early 1900s, came through Angel Island, became a community leader. This was a community-led effort to rename parts of Shattuck Avenue right in downtown Berkeley to be named after her. So I think all of these efforts are really inspiring, and I'm still hopeful that the next time I welcome a class, students into the classroom, that they'll be able to name a whole host of other people and events. And there's a thunderstorm happening outside my window, so I don't know if you can hear that, but that's the noise coming.
That was dramatic. That was
Wow.
dramatic. Well, and in thinking about what you said about your students, I mean, what I want to believe in my hopeful heart is that, all of the hyphenated studies movements that we've seen not only in the country, but also in the academy, over the last, let's say, 4 decades, we could say 5 decades since some of these, spaces and departments and units were established. I want to feel like it's moving towards a much broader common understanding that moves across culture. And that I think that in filling that space, either we're responding to violence or there is sort of the call to the triumphal, right? So, people know, we do this thing so well, or, this hero climbed this mountain, and everything is in between, right? I mean, everything is in between. So, we just got to keep moving, right? Or maybe there's something to say about that space between, reactive to violence and crisis and, triumphal pride. Anybody?
Well, Elizabeth, if I can just say that there really are efforts. I think both Erika and Mae, and we're speaking to the frustration of over time of, for as long as we've been working in these fields and telling these stories, that the latest survey of young people, to ask them, can you name anybody of X background who was made any kind of contribution to America at all? And when it comes time to naming anybody of Asian descent, the most common answer is don't know. I mean, and so what is going, and that's been consistent all along. I mean, don't know, who are these Asians? And so the invisibility of this history, of the everything in between that you just said, it's shocking. And that's why even in this time of 2.5 years so far of intense anti-Asian hatred that's been going on, one of the most common responses to that is, wow, I didn't even know you Asians experienced discrimination. How can this happen? And even Asian Americans themselves are so surprised, some, because we have all been deprived, really deprived and denied this knowledge and this history. But there are efforts to change that. I do want to point out that Illinois and New Jersey and just passed laws in their state legislatures that there has to be some kind of curriculum from K through 12, so primary school through high school, because it doesn't really exist anywhere. And that's why even after how many years, if a college student can even know that there were railroad workers or a massive incarceration of Japanese Americans, it's like, wow, congratulations, you won a prize. But actually, there is so much more to be told. So Illinois, New Jersey, I think there's at least another 9 or 10 states that have some kind of effort going on. The state of California just signed into law that ethnic studies has to be taught K through 12. There should be some kind of curriculum. And that's where it really has to begin. We're seeing shooters younger and younger. I mean, Buffalo, an 18-year-old, really? And where is their knowledge? It's just so empty. But not completely empty. It's filled with poison. And so that's what we have to put real history, the real connectedness, all that in between space that you were talking about. Yes, we've got to do something about it.
You know what? I completely agree with that. And a bill was just introduced in New York, I think this week, for K-12 curriculum and Asian American studies. And actually, I've been writing for the New York Department of Education for an Asian American curricular website. So there is voluntary teaching that goes on in our schools, but hopefully we'll get a bill to make it required in New York State soon. But one thing that we haven't talked about is how Americans perceive Asian Americans and Chinese Americans in relationship to U.S.-China relations and how China is perceived. And I think this is the 800-pound gorilla, perhaps, in the room. It's always shaped how Chinese Americans are perceived, received, treated, excluded, suspected. It's always related to China. And I believe that the exclusion laws, when they were passed in the late 19th century, were not just aimed at keeping Chinese out of the country because they weren't white, although that was the explicit and proximate reason, but also it was an effort to contain China, to prevent China's people and China's capital from infiltrating the West. So because China was never formally colonized, so the West could not control the movement of Chinese people in the way that it could, say, for a colony like India, or even, in other instances. So the exclusion laws, I think, were not only aimed at making sure that California and the United States was a white man's country, but also to contain China and to preserve a kind of colonial type of relationship. And obviously, the United States relationship with China today is different. But again, of course, China's a competitor, an economic competitor. And I don't take a side in this. I don't say China's, or US, or whatever. I think there's bad actors on all sides and too much nationalism on both sides. But it's the fear of Chinese competition, and you see the same racist stereotypes kind of repurposed today, right? In the 19th century, Chinese were accused of being coolies or like slaves because they allegedly worked for wages that no white people would work for. Well, today's coolies are the Chinese in factories that produce cheap goods, right? And it's also deemed as unfair competition. Or Chinese students, Chinese and Chinese American students who are abnormal or pathological because they study too hard, right? And so there's also a kind of unfair competition that's seen, right? And in both cases, they're driven by despotic masters, whether it's the Chinese communists or the Tiger Mothers, right? So you see the same stereotypes that have very deep historical roots kind of repurposed and adapted to today's conditions. And a lot of this is, I think, what drives a lot of the anti-Chinese and anti-Asian discrimination and violence. And unless we can kind of wrap our heads around that, I think it's hard to understand that we're all part of one people, one society, one history. Helen mentioned Frederick Douglass. What Frederick Douglass said in that amazing speech in 1869 when he opposed Chinese exclusion, he said, "Let the Chinese come." He said, "Migration is a human right, and we are a composite nation. So let them come." And, people are afraid that too many will come because China is a very big country. He said, "Let them all come. It's fine. They'll become part of us." And Douglass was giving this country a choice that linked the fates of African Americans with Chinese and other people of color. I mean, they didn't use that phrase in the 19th century, but he was saying, are we going to be a democratic country or are we going to be a racist country? And I think that's the same choice that we face today. Do we want to be a democratic country? It's not just about inclusion, it's about democracy, right? Who do they want to prevent from voting? Who do they want to take the vote away from? It's about democracy versus a white supremacist view of America. And that idea that we saw in Buffalo, replacement theory, that is not a new idea. That idea has been around since the late 19th century. And in the early 20th century, people spilled a lot of ink on this theory, writing books called The Passing of the Great White Race or The Rising Tide of Color, because Europe is not a majority of the world's people. It's not, but it controls, Europe and the United States control the majority of the world's wealth. So what are we going to do about that, especially at a time when the planet itself is in danger? So I think the lesson I think a lot from history is not only as Helen said, I really agree that it's about connecting all of us as humans, right, with a shared experience, but it's also about a choice that we have as individuals and as a society. Do we want to be a democracy or do we want to be, an authoritarian state? Those are the choices that are before us.
As the young folks say, that was a word, Professor Ngai. Thank you.
And I just want to say, I'm from New Jersey too.
Oh.
we Jerseyans rock.
Well, I think, one of the hard things also amongst all the hard things is thinking about, we're focused today, or our starting place today is Chinese American history, Chinese American identity, but then in our next part of our title is Asian American. So I would love to have each of you talk about the complexities of naming and navigating and coalition building under a huge umbrella identity with so many different, histories, experiences, languages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do you come to thinking about and working with this thing called Asian American?
I'll start by noting that the term itself is, of course, a product of history. Before the label Asian American existed, it was Oriental. So you hit the nail on the head in terms of the complexity of this. We have seen during the pandemic how the so-called China virus has targeted not just peoples of Chinese descent, but also a range of Korean, Thai, Vietnamese, Filipino, Pacific Islanders. They're part of this complexity of the racial formation of Asians. Going back centuries, really, is to homogenize, to lump all Asians together as one group, and particularly as Chinese. Here in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities, we have one of the largest Hmong American populations. outside of Laos. And one of the very first hate crimes reported in the press was targeting a Hmong American family in the suburbs who were blamed for bringing the so-called China virus to the neighborhood. So there's this complexity in which the great diversity of Asian Americans have been lumped together. But with that has also come, with the shared experience, has also come a call for unity, a call for collaboration, an understanding that there are shared challenges and problems, also unique challenges and problems, but that the Asian American, and I'm specifically sticking to Asian American because the Asian American Pacific Islander umbrella is also another one. But with the Asian American pan-ethnic identity is one that is constantly in flux, that is growing, changing. People are adopting into it, but it is by no means is it stable. Is it uniform? It presents some challenges, but it's also, I think, especially in this moment, a unifying call as well.
Can I just say too, in total agreement with what Erika just outlined, but it is a complicated topic to address in a very brief time because, as was pointed out, the vast majority of the people of the world, number one, come from Asia or the Pacific. And then if you take people of color from all of the non-Anglo locations, I mean, that is the majority. And so within Asia, nobody says they're Asian. You could say that there are no Asians in Asia because people will identify more, not even possibly with a country, but from a region, a location, a culture. There are more than 1.4 billion Chinese just in the continent where China is. If you took the Chinese diaspora, there are just lots and lots. And so the diversity, even within the moniker of China and who is Chinese, people might not identify. They might say, oh, I'm from, this village in China or this part of India, and not even say that they're from that country. So then, I mean, as Erika was pointing out, Asian America and that terminology has a time and place. It has a context. In a way, it's a construct because especially with newer immigrants, and the vast majority of Asian Americans today are immigrants, meaning that their primary identity of where they were formed as a child is not in the United States. And that's a shifting thing because I actually think sometime in the future, who knows when, that might shift. And there might be a majority of Asians in America who are actually, born in America, and they have a very different concept of their relationship to New Jersey, for example, versus where my parents were from, in a particular province of China. And so it's complicated because as human beings, we don't have just one identity. So in one gathering of people, I might identify as Asian American. In another, I might talk about being Chinese or being an American-born Chinese. And all of those have different connotations. But to your point about how then do we bring people together? I mean, that's why the term Asian American was created, to say that we actually have a common voice. If we bring our voices together, we can do something about the invisibility, about the hate crimes, about the long history that is not just about East Asians, but also includes South Asians, Southeast Asians, Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians. And so we're really talking about yellow and brown people of all mixtures and textures. And that's who falls into this Asian American umbrella. And so I understand that it's hard for other communities or even within the Asian American umbrella to kind of like grab that and say, well, what does this mean? But in terms of reaching out to other communities, I did want to say that I think that unity and people coming together is a little harder today because then, let's say, the Vincent Chin case, when that was 40 years ago, and Asian American and African American and Brown Americans came together to stand up because to stand up for each other. Um, because we've gone through more than 4 decades, 5 decades, 6 decades of real
Mhm.
intensive effort to divide people, to, for example, take Asian Americans and prop them up as a wedge, as this so-called, racist myth of the model minority that, and
Mhm.
what does that mean? That this is the good minority, as opposed to who? If there's a good minority, there's a bad minority. And that formulation came out in 1966, in the New York Times and US News Report. What was happening in 1966? It was the civil rights movement. And suddenly this enemy alien that was, you know, trying to be driven out and lynched and massacred throughout America suddenly became a good minority. And so
Mm.
we're talking about decades of trying to pit one group against each other. And unfortunately, I see, just in my time as a writer and an activist, I think that wedge has grown deeper and deeper. And so we have a lot of unlearning to do, a lot of really trying to reclaim the stories of Frederick Douglass, for example, or uh, why the march to in Selma across the Pettus Bridge, that there's that famous photo of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in the whole first row wearing leis, flower leis from Hawaii. Well, why were
Mm.
they wearing leis? Because a lot of people from Hawaii came to participate, and not just them, but there were Asian Americans who were part of these movements too. And we don't know those stories. And in the
Mhm.
absence of those stories, there have been active ways of trying to create, ways to make people distrust each other. I've been reading essays of professors who have been teaching the story of Vincent Chin and having student journals where they're writing about, I saw this movie, what did it mean to me? And some of those journals say things like, I never thought of Asian Americans having any kind of racism at all. I thought all Asians hated Black people. And as a Black person, that made me not like them. But in
Mm.
seeing this movie, it made me understand more. And that's just one film. And the same thing from
Mhm.
Asian Americans saying, I thought all Black people hated Asians. And this is the kind of poison that we have today that isn't just there in the air, it has actively been created and fomented, and this whole thing of replacement theory and all of that. I mean, that is in a response to the growing migrations and the growth of the communities of color. And as long as the communities of color, and people of conscience, as long as we are divided among each other, we will not be able to overcome, these very specific scientifically formulated ways to keep us apart. And that's
Mhm.
why they're there, to keep us apart. Because if you can imagine people of color, people of conscience, all the people who have stood up in all of these movements, you know, if we came together for our common good and this democracy, as Mae was pointing out, we are the majority. And that's why they are so afraid.
Mhm. Mhm. We have so many questions, and so I'm going to turn to some of them from this very, very engaged audience, and we can sort of snap answer them, and we can maybe get to a few more. I'm going to put one together. This from Sonia Adams at St. John's University asks, are there current works of Asian American literature that you recommend for instructors to teach in college courses? What are you currently reading? And I would put that with Genevieve Guzman, writing from the University of Georgia. How has Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior aged since its publication in 1976? So we can literature for a moment.
Um, well, I think Woman Warrior holds its own after all these years. It's really powerful. It's powerful as a narrative, as a reflection or meditation on history, and especially in the Asian American and Chinese American case, on the role of women, who are often, even more invisible uh, to outsiders. So I think it holds up really, really well. Um, what am I reading now? Well, I'm reading a new book that just came out, written by a colleague of mine, Mae Lee. Is called The Evening Hero, and it's a novel based very loosely on her father's experience, who was a Korean-born a doctor in Minnesota, and then living the so-called American dream in the 60s, and then things take a terrible turn as he encounters all kinds of forces of racism in society. So that's just come out. I think it's going to be a bestseller. I want to plug it. I think it's a great story. Um, and one of my favorites is now a few years old is uh, Viet Nguyen's The Sympathizer. Um,
Hmm.
I personally, well, I don't know. I couldn't finish the second book. I don't know if I should say that live. It was very violent. But the first book, which is also violent, but it's a very really deep look at the war in Vietnam and refugees, and how the Vietnamese people were themselves so divided, um, uh, by their families, by ideologies, by commitments. And that was the Pulitzer Prize winner. And I think that's something that, if you want to understand the war in Vietnam from a Vietnamese perspective, if you want to understand what it means to be a refugee in this
Hmm.
country, and we've talked a lot about immigration, but a lot of Asian Americans are from refugee backgrounds. I mean, Erica mentioned the
Hmm.
Hmong in Minnesota, which is a huge refugee, a descendant community. And the Vietnamese obviously are refugees, or come from refugee backgrounds. I say this is an important part of the Asian American experience, which is not the same as the immigration story. It's a
Hmm.
different story. And it's a story that's born of war. And so much of it is not pretty in terms of why they were uprooted and forced to leave. But anyway, so I would recommend those two books: The Evening Hero by Marie Myung Ok Lee, and The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen. I don't know. What are you guys reading?
Well, if I
Helen,
could
Erica?
mention a couple of my favorites too, I agree that Maxine Hong King's Woman Warrior, I mean, you know, it's a landmark book. It was something I read when I was, just getting a consciousness too. But in the meantime, there have been so many more books that have come out that really capture the breadth of um, some of the breadth of the experience of Asian Americans. And as Mae was pointing out, The Sympathizer. I would like to say I loved Ocean Vuong's book on Earth We Are
Hmm.
Briefly Beautiful, that is about a
Hmm.
queer Asian American refugee Vietnamese family. And
Right,
so it
right.
really covers, just shows the complexity of our humanity. And in the more memoir reflection point is the book Minor Feelings, Park Hong, Kathy Hong Park.
Right,
Hmm.
Tell
right.
me, yeah, but
Park Hong.
Park
um,
Hong. Yeah.
Park Hong,
Hmm.
thank
Kathy
you.
Hong.
Yeah, okay. Kathy Hong's book just really is, in a way, a manifesto, an emotional manifesto of what it means to be Asian American
Right.
today. And this is even before the pandemic began. And so many of the books are sagas of telling the stories of being people who come out of war and catastrophe. I've been watching, so there are a lot of films and television programs as well. I've been watching Pachinko, which is based on Min Jin Lee's multi-generational story of a Korean family, and what they went through: wars, civil war, just all kinds of crises, and that diaspora. But so many of those books really tell so much of the story of why it is there are Asians in America. So there are tons of books. I just think, don't stop at Woman Warrior. There's so much and in terms of video and movies as well.
I used to try to keep up on all of the year's new fiction reads over the summer when I was in graduate school, and then you cannot do that now. It's really a wonderful phenomenon when there are so many memoirs. So my students routinely read Cal Kalia Yang's The Late Homecomer, which is the first Hmong American memoir, beautifully written. Her second book, The Song Poet, is also one of my favorites. They also read excerpts of Tian Julie Wang's Beautiful Country, Albert Samaha's Concepcion, Jose Antonio Vargas's memoir about being an undocumented immigrant. And they loved portions of a new scholarly book by Ma Vang called History on the Run, which really questions, like going back to your first question, Elizabeth, which really helps us think about how do we capture and preserve history when one literally is on the run as a refugee, as an exile? Where is our history preserved? How is it? How do we read history when it's sewn into our clothes, when we carry it with us in just a few artifacts? It was very compelling for them.
Thank you. I would add to the list a great book of poetry, just to make sure you have poetry on there, called Yellow Rain by Mai Dervong, that came out recently, that is extraordinary because it is what you might call documentary or collage poetry. I mean, she's mining family histories and also documentary to get at the story of biological warfare against the Hmong. And the form of it is extraordinary. Mai Dervong, Yellow Rain. So that's poetry for the list. Here's a question from Xiaotong Wang at the University of Oregon. What can ordinary citizens do to advocate for the removal of all discriminatory clauses in historical laws and regulations? For instance, in some city ordinances, there still remains discriminatory rhetoric directed at African Americans, Asian Americans, and what is the best approach to educate the American public against these wrongful acts? I think that's a really interesting question about, kind of local citizenship and what is built into local laws and regulations that we might not even know is there.
Some of the activism, a lot of the activism right now is being based around these local efforts. So, for example, in San Francisco, it was some high school students, some college students going to the Chinese Historical Society in San Francisco, doing this research, meeting with their city supervisor, and then, advocating for a resolution. So a lot of this is the hard work of the historian going into the archives, finding those statutes, but then, finding a receptive ear in local and city government. It does seem like we are at this moment in time when there are more people listening, more people receptive than any time before. So these kinds of efforts would be in line with what we're seeing around the country, but driven from the local community.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Anything else about local community kind of work that anyone wanted to add?
Well,
I'll just say it's a great way.
Go ahead, Mae.
I was just going to say, echoing Erika, I think it's a great way to start is in a local setting. It's hard to organize nationally. You need a national organization. You need a lot of coalition and networking, and those are important too. And we do have those networks. But ordinary people can get involved in their town or in their city, their community, and in some ways, it's a good way to build personal ties and build the kind of unity with others in your community. So I think it's a great idea. Get students or community people to do the research and put a resolution before your city council. Get petitions. I think working at the local is a great place to do it.
And let me just jump on that to say, yes, organizing and social change is all about act local, think global. It
Right.
begins with what's happening to the people around you. And the good thing today is because there is social media, every one of us who has access to a smartphone or to the internet can take a picture of that ordinance that they found in the library or wherever they found it and post it somewhere, share it, and then take it further. As Mae was saying, a petition, take it to the city council, take it to the school board, wherever. But it's all about sharing it, connecting with other people who want to make a difference, and then don't stop there. It's all about, we connect with other people. If a piece of our, community's history is missing, we know that other communities' histories are missing too. Connect with each other. And that's where change happens. It's by, acting local and then thinking, okay, this is part of something bigger. It's part of something maybe even systemic or part of the infrastructure of America, that if we actually do something, we can contribute to making this democracy a democracy. So, you know, that's what it's going to take from every one of us. And I'll just say one thing further. If we do nothing, if you find something and you do nothing, then we're part of the problem. If we do nothing, that is just letting things continue the way they are. And we all know that we've got to make things better.
Well, this has been such a beautiful conversation. We have so many more questions that we're not able to get to, but I would like to invite each of you just to go around, and maybe our order will be Erika, Mae, Helen, to leave us with a final thought, a final word, a final suggestion, a final call, something we didn't get to, anything that you want to leave us with in what I know will be an ongoing conversation amongst ourselves and with all of the circles of conversation that are in the reach of today. So, Erika, if you could start.
Thank you so much. First of all, this has been a fun, dare I say, fun conversation, and also really inspirational. I have both a frustration, but also inspiration. The frustration has been that I feel that we as historians of Asian America, that we constantly have to repeat the very basics of Asian American history, and that limits us to getting into the deeper conversations and also solution building. But here's pivoting to the inspiration. I've had the opportunity to speak with a number of young people, youth activists who've been involved with Make Us Visible New Jersey. New Jersey seems to be a theme here. Make Us Visible New Jersey, involved in pushing for the legislation requiring Asian American history at the state level. They are incredible. They know what they're doing. They're reaching out, they're organizing, they're creating magazines, organizations. They give me hope. They give me hope for the next generation. And so there's still a lot of work to do, but I think we're all going to be in their good hands.
Thank you. Mae?
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, and to Mellon for hosting this. I think it's been a really stimulating and vigorous conversation. So thank you. I want to touch on something that we only kind of alluded to, and that's we didn't talk about it in much depth about, Asian Americans and relationship to other people of color, especially right now with the racism against Black people in this country. And I think there's a lot of hand wringing over this. What is what is our relationship? What should it be? And I guess I want to use something that an Afro-British cultural theorist named Stuart Hall taught us, which is that there's no such thing as racism in general. There are racisms. And racism is always specific. It's historically produced according to political and social circumstances. And so, Elizabeth, your new book on the Trayvon generation is so powerful. It's so powerful, and I think everybody needs to read that book. All Asian Americans should read that book to understand what the community has gone through. But people also need to understand our communities and what Asian Americans have gone through. And it's not a competition. It's
Mhm.
not a trauma competition. It's not an oppression competition. It's to understand the different the different specificities of racisms in this country and how they all are actually related. They're all woven together. And I think, as Helen said before, very powerfully, there's been a lot of work done in the last generation to divide us. But there's also a lot of work that people like those of us and others who've done to try to reach across those divisions. So I think if we want to have a democratic society, I think we have to think about how to have solidarity and how to understand racisms in America in all of its complex manifestations and challenges. And I think that, as I said before, we always have a choice. And so we have to think about what kind of choices we're going to make for our future and the future of our children and our communities. So thank you.
Thank you. Helen.
Well, there's not much more I can add to what Erika and Mae have said. I just want to thank you, Elizabeth, and the Mellon Foundation for having this conversation, and maybe leave with this thought. We're having this moment right now in 2022, which I think everybody will agree is a time fraught with all kinds of issues, problems, challenges for the future. And one day, in another generation, there will be other historians, other people having a conversation, looking at this time, at 2022. And as we in today look at other times past and we wonder, what were people thinking? What were they doing? What were they doing to take on the challenges that they knew were right there? And so I would just put this out as a challenge. How will each of us, everyone who's watching, everybody we know, everybody we can reach, what are we going to be doing so that one day in the not so distant future, when people say, what did you do? How did you use the choices that you had, the agency that you had to make a difference in the things that we see coming at us, today? And we all have a role to play in this, big, small, whatever. We can all do something. And whether it's true or not, I believe this that inspires me. The arc of history does bend toward justice, but it takes us to make it bend, to help make it bend. And that's what it's going to take. So thinking about what can we do today that will make a difference in the next generation when they look back at all of us. So thank you for having this conversation that is all about looking at history and what it means today and tomorrow. So thank you for doing this.
Well, thank you all. I am filled with respect and admiration and hope and goodness. So thank you so very much for today. And thank you everybody who tuned in and listened and offered so many wonderful, wonderful questions and comments. And we look forward to engaging with you at more Mellon Foundation events. Thank you.
Thanks.